In our last lecture, we looked at conceptualizing power and partnerships. We undertook a Weberian analysis of how to examine class, status groups, and political parties that make up the structure of society. We understood that power and domination involves various attributes, and this sort of power and domination also leads to forms of legitimacy when it comes to power. In this lecture, we'll be looking at government-private enterprise relationships. It will be one of two lectures we have on this topic. The impetus for government-private enterprise relationships lie in a desire to bring private capital and management to public service provisions. Now, the reasons for involving private capital are clear enough. The process provides new money, managerial skills, access to innovative technology, and novel approaches to service delivery. What is probably most important is that when private agents pledge their own resources, they have a strong incentive to closely monitor project management to ensure the best possible overall financial return on their investment. At the same time, if there is uncertainty over how best to manage a project and technical issues that make it difficult to monitor the relationship between inputs and results, financial incentives help steer and keep a check on private agents' behavior. In other words, properly aligned incentives require private partners to assume appropriate shares of risk and rewards, and this improves the likelihood of a successful and cost-effective outcome, and thereby generates social gains. When public managers incur debt on others' behalf, and when they do not share directly in the financial benefits of a successful project, they have less of an incentive to carefully monitor a project's performance. Further, when a project is operated by a private institution with a financial stake in collecting appropriate user fees or tolls, the costs of the project are passed on through to users in proportion to the benefit they receive, and investment by willing participants potentially frees residents of the tax burden associated with public debt interest costs. Of course, to the extent they are thereafter charged for services, they will still pay, although payment will become tied to usage and the economic efficiency of the arrangement will typically improve. Getting private money to the table with proper incentive mechanisms obviously serves to keep down operational costs. Moreover, partnerships can make new infrastructure available for public use much more quickly than through conventional procurement. This is important because of the continuous challenge of persuading policymakers and voters of the need to steer resources to capital construction and maintenance projects. We emphasize this because infrastructure spending in OECD nations have been crowded out by mounting debt. That debt typically was not issued in support of construction, but to fund current services. In many Western jurisdictions, the politics that drive the expansion of social spending push down the priority attached to long-lived infrastructure initiatives. Governments wishing to see large infrastructure projects fall into place must wrestle with competing demands for available resources. As a result, the decisions about whether and when to proceed and at what scale are inevitably political ones. There are elaborate cost-benefit analyses that we can establish to try to understand the economic merit of a project. However, they cannot resolve the political merits of one choice over another. A bridge or a highway extension might be an economically justifiable venture. However, to build it this year or next year or in the latter future, or to launch a different project first, are questions that can be answered only through political calculus and negotiation. The result is that a publicly financed infrastructure project will tend to be developed over a much longer period than a privately financed one, even when the project's managerial and technical issues are similar. In short, no Western government produces all of its input in-house. There is no single agreed upon definition of the multicultural or transnational enterprises. This is because multinationality has many dimensions and can be viewed from several perspectives: economic, political, and/or legal. Some argue that ownership is the key criteria. A firm becomes multinational only when the headquarters or the parent company is effectively owned by nationals of two or more nations. For example, Shell and Unilever are controlled by British and Dutch interests are really good examples here. However, by ownership tests, very few multinationals can be called multinational. The ownership of the overwhelming majority of multinational corporations are uninational. According to the nationality mix of headquarter manager thesis, an international company is multinational if the managers of the parent company are nationals of several nations. Usually, managers of the headquarters are nationals of the home nation. This may be a transitional phenomenon, however. Very few companies pass this test currently. Nevertheless, the business strategy of a multinational is often global profit maximization. Ethnocentric companies follow policies that are home country oriented. Polycentric companies follow policies that are host country oriented. And geocentric companies follow policies that are world oriented. A multinational corporation is a parent company that engages in foreign production through its affiliates located in several nations. It exercises direct control over the policies of its affiliates and implements business strategies in production, marketing, finance, and staffing that transcend national boundaries, i.e. a geocentric understanding. There's a key bits we need to understand about the nature of multinationals. Namely, multinational corporations exhibit no loyalty to the country in which they are incorporated. In this context, many case studies, as well as more generalized analysis of MNE-Government relations, reflect one of two models that have gained widespread attention, namely the sovereignty at bay model and the dependency model. Both are still prominent phrases in the lexicon of international business, though by now the phrases may be regarded as passé by many. The central questions and themes of the models, however, reflect perennial issues of international business-government relations. For instance, what are the contextual determinants of MNE-government relations? To what extent and in what fora do MNEs and governments cooperate with one another? On what issues are conflictual relations especially prevalent? What are the outcomes of conflicts between them? One of the key propositions of the sovereignty at bay model was that the inherent nature of MNEs led them to infringe on the sovereignty of nations and a nation state. In that sense, MNEs are posited to be in a powerful position and national governments in a weak position in their relations. However, the focus on the sovereignty at bay model is on the conflictual adversarial aspects of this relationship, particularly in host nations and to a lesser extent in home nations. The dependency model, in contrast, assumes MNEs to be frequently in a sort of a cooperative partnership with home governments and a conflictual adversarial relationship with host governments. The latter governments, however, in a relatively weak dependent position. Now, there's a third model we can actually articulate, and it's called the neo-mercantilist model, which emphasizes the constraints imposed on the freedom of the home national governments to pursue their national security and economic goals by multinational enterprises. This model has received much less attention in the literature than the sovereignty at bay or dependency models, but it does have important empirical as well as normative implications. In particular, MNEs are viewed as powerful, and home governments as weak in their relations. Bargaining models are also prominent in our understanding of government and private enterprise relationships. The outcomes of MNE government bargaining depend on the relative stakes as well as the relative resources of the two. MNEs do not merely passively react to given conditions in their political environments. Rather, MNEs try to shape their political environment through a variety of means in their relations with governments. These studies of MNE-government relations can be summarized in terms of whether the emphasis is on open or closed political processes. Put differently, open meaning the public, or closed meaning elitist sort of political processes. It also is determined whether the emphasis is on a conflictual adversarial relations or a cooperative partnership relations with governments. And it also has to be understood whether the emphasis is on the ability of MNEs to achieve their objectives vis-a-vis governments, that is, their power. The rise of high-performance market economies in East Asia, specifically Taiwan, Korea, and Japan, has attracted strong interest in understanding their interactions of government and private enterprises. Part of this formula for success is the importance of institutions, insulated technocracies, and bureaucratic capacities. Whether to establish new industries and create new products, or to upgrade quality, technologies, and skills, the East Asian experience has emphasized the advantages of a publicly coordinated approach to industrial innovation. The governed market theory builds the view that active governments and strategic industrial policy played a central part in several nations' success. We can go further and argue the importance of institutional arrangements that made such a strategic approach possible. Namely, we saw there's a strong and intimate relationship between the state sector and the private enterprise sector. So the governed market theory advances three main propositions. First, the superior performance of Japan and the newly industrialized countries is the result of heavy investment in internationally competitive, high-growth industries. Moreover, the patterning and level of investment are different from what would have been the case if market mechanisms alone had operated. Second, the exceptional levels of investment in increasingly high technology sectors is a deliberate outcome of a set of strategic industrial policies. The third proposition by governed market theory is that at a deeper level of causality, these policies were pursued with more consistency and were relatively more effective than in other developing nations, because again of this set of a unique sort of institutional arrangements, in this case a strong autonomous state that had a very intimate relationship with the market or with private enterprises. Another theory that's salient to understand government-private enterprise relationships is governed interdependence theory. This approach differs from governed market theory in two key respects. The first difference to note concerns the larger system nurtured by public policies, which institutionalizes a dynamic response from industry. The proposition here is that the ability of East Asian firms and industry more generally to adapt quickly to economic change is based on a system that socializes risk and thereby coordinates change across a broad array of organizations, both public and private. In this system, firms are relieved from bearing the entire burden of four major risks: raising capital, developing new products and technologies, funding new markets, and training skilled engineers and workers. A significant proportion of the cost of upgrading technology, new product development, industrial training, market expansion are shared by or embedded in a thick network of state-informed institutions or public-private institutions. Beneath that system, however, and what makes these policies so effective is a particular kind of state structure and a particular kind of relationship between the state and industry, a governed interdependence. So governed interdependence theory is describing a system of central coordination based on the cooperation of government and industry. Policies for this or that industry, sector, or technology are not simply imposed by bureaucrats or politicians. They are the result of regular and extensive consultation and coordination with the private sector. Government's developmental project does not lose out to clientistic or sectional interests because of insulated policymaking. Business does not lose out to remote and bumbling bureaucrats because of institutional connectedness. But the notion that the state's ability to impose its decisions is central to its effectiveness, and it's contradicted by historical instances. Unilateralism is more likely to be a developmental minus than a plus. It implies the capacity to act, but not necessarily to act effectively. What really matters is whether the state is able to use its autonomy to consult and to elicit consensus and cooperation from the private sector. This is not the kind of power over society that one associates with authoritarian governments. It is power through society, which is much more potent in developmental terms. This concludes the first half of our lecture on government-private enterprise relationships. We will continue in our next lecture to discuss this theme in greater depth.